The year was 1883, and Missouri was a land caught between the quiet promise of progress and the dark reminders of a lawless past. Dirt roads wound their way through silent fields, and small towns clung to life with dusty storefronts, saloons lit by flickering lanterns, and churches that stood tall as symbols of faith in uncertain times. But beyond the towns, stretching deep into the countryside, there were places people preferred not to speak of. Places where the roads ended, where the farms grew thin, and where whispers of darker things settled among the trees like a fog that never lifted. It was in one of these isolated corners that the Harper family lived. To outsiders, they were no more than another farming clan trying to survive off the unforgiving land. But among neighbors, and especially among those who dared travel near their property, a different reputation preceded them. People talked of the Harpers in hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly might carry their words to unwelcome ears. Some claimed the family was cursed. Others said they were little more than cutthroats disguised as farmers. Yet what no one could imagine, or perhaps what some dared not believe, was the terrible truth that would forever stain their name, a truth soaked in hunger, blood, and the unspeakable act of turning upon their own. The land around the Harper farmyard told its own story. Weather-beaten fences leaned against the pressure of winds that seemed to howl longer and harder there than anywhere else. The farmhouse itself lingered on the horizon like a scar, its roof sagging, its walls patched with mismatched boards, a structure that seemed always on the verge of collapse but, against all odds, never did. And near it, scattered barns and sheds sat crooked, their doors swinging on rusted hinges, their contents long since stripped down to essentials. It was not beauty that marked the Harperland, but a kind of stubborn, miserable endurance, an endurance that mirrored those who lived there. The Harper clan was large, made up of several brothers, their wives and children, all bound together, yet strangely apart from the communities surrounding them. They rarely came to town, and when they did, their presence spread unease. Their clothes were worn, their faces sunken, their voices low, and although they spent little, they always had currency. Sometimes gold coins, sometimes odd trinkets which no one could quite explain. Neighbors wondered where such things came from, but no one dared ask directly. In those days, curiosity could be fatal. Stories began quietly. Strange disappearances along the rural trails. Travelers who never reached their destinations. Drifters who seemed to vanish after being seen wandering near the Harperland. To some, these were coincidences. They were dangerous times, after all. But to others, a pattern was taking shape, a shadow growing darker with each passing season. Inside the Harper farmhouse, life was far from ordinary. The family clung together with a loyalty that was at once fierce and unsettling. Outsiders would have seen little warmth in their interactions. Meals were eaten in silence, glares often replaced smiles, and everything seemed governed by a heavy, unspoken law. Whatever the family did, it was for survival, and survival had no room for weakness. But behind those cold, tense dinners, there was another truth, one whispered only in surrounding towns and sworn upon by those claiming to have heard screams at night drifting from the hills. Some said the Harper's table was set not only with bread or game from the woods, but with meat not fit to be mentioned aloud. Meat that belonged to men. By the fall of 1883, the rumors reached their darkest peak. Farmers as far south as Arkansas and up toward Kansas City traded tales in saloons, speaking of a family in the Missouri hills that had turned to eating its own. No one knew exactly how much truth lived inside the story, but everyone knew enough to be afraid. One thing was certain. Whenever the name Harper was spoken, the air seemed to change. Journeys were planned to avoid that part of the countryside, and townsfolk warned children never to wander too far. For by then, it was no longer a question of what the Harpers might do, but what they had already done. What made the story so chilling was not just the whispers of cannibalism, but the idea that it began not with strangers, but with their very kin. A family meant to protect, nurture, and endure together had instead crumbled inward, feeding upon one another in the most literal sense. And when hunger, desperation, and cruelty mix in the human spirit, the line between survival and savagery disappears almost entirely. The first name to survive in records of rumor was Elijah Harper, the eldest of the clan. Tall, harsh, and unyielding, Elijah was said to rule his siblings and kin like a tyrant. Hunger may have driven the family to desperation, but it was his hand that made choices no one else dared. He was not merely a farmer, but a man feared even within his household, where his word held the force of law. It was his conviction that survival justified anything, that would hand down the direst legacy of all. And so, the legend begins. With a quiet farmhouse set against rolling hills, with whispers traveling faster than facts, and with a family whose bond, twisted by fear and hunger, gave rise to the darkest chapter Missouri would ever dare claim, people told themselves it was a story too horrifying to believe, a tale to frighten children and warn travelers. But those who lived closest, those who swore they saw things or worse, heard them, would stand by their testimony even until their dying breath. The Harper name became more than a family. It became a warning. For deep in the hills, past the prairies and roads, beyond the reach of laws or prayers, something truly monstrous was said to stir not in the wilderness, but in human hearts. And as the world would soon learn, the truth inside those hills was darker than any tale passed from drunken lips in a saloon. And that is where our journey begins. In Missouri, in the year 1883, with a farmhouse that was more than a home. It was a nest of shadows, and the silence within it was the kind that hides screams. As autumn deepened in Missouri, the landscape itself seemed to conspire in keeping the Harper legend alive. The trees lost their leaves earlier in those hills, their crooked branches reaching like skeletal arms against the gray November skies. The earth grew cold and damp, the trails muddy and treacherous, and a quiet weight pressed down on the countryside. In town, farmers hurried with their final harvests, shopkeepers stocked supplies for the long winter, and church bells tolled with warnings of repentance. Beyond those faint reaches of community, isolation swallowed the Harper farm whole, leaving it in silence, where rumors bred like wildfire in the dark. People began to notice details, small things that may have meant little on their own, but together told a more sinister story. A wagon wheel found broken along a rural road, but no wagon to be seen. A pair of boots discovered abandoned near a creek, their leather split and soaked with water. And then, most damning of all, a horse wandering loose, its saddle empty, drifting across the fields near the Harper land with no rider to claim it. The sheriff's men spoke of investigating, but in truth, few dared set foot near the property. Some justified their hesitation by claiming it was too far, too wild, not worth the trouble. But the truth was simpler. The Harpers inspired fear in a way no court nor badge could overcome. To accuse them directly would mean confrontation, and in those days, justice often fell quiet when faced with an entire family ready to protect one another with rifles, blades, and silence. In the saloons of the nearby towns, whispers grew thicker with each night. A drifter over his whiskey swore he heard gunshots in the hills one evening, and the echo of screams fading too quickly, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Families traveling west told stories of companions who vanished near that cursed stretch of land. And always at the heart of the rumors was the Harper farmhouse, that sagging, crooked building people claimed could devour men whole. Had it been only disappearances, perhaps the Harpers would have remained a whispered caution. But hunger, it was said, changes everything. By late that year, food was scarce. The crops had been poor, livestock thin, and drought left many small farmers with bare shelves. Yet somehow, strangely, the Harpers endured. Their chickens always seemed to roam. Their pigs fattened despite the dry spells. When neighbors questioned how they managed, the answer came only with unsettling stares or silence. From that silence, tales were born. Children whispered that the Harpers ate men. Mothers hushed them. Fathers laughed uneasily, but the words lingered. For in a world where hunger bent morality to its breaking point, the possibility seemed too real to dismiss. There were accounts, second-hand but striking, of travelers lured into the Harper household. They were said to be welcomed not kindly but stiffly, with offers of food and shelter. The next morning, those travelers would be gone. And yet in town days later, a Harper might appear with new clothing, boots too fine for a farmer or trinkets too delicate for their station. No one confronted them outright, but everyone noticed. Everyone remembered. At the heart of it all was Elijah Harper. When he came to town, people parted before him as though he carried a sickness. His frame was imposing, his face weathered but sharp, his eyes cold and unblinking. He rarely spoke more than a few words, yet when he did, his tone left no room for argument. He would purchase only the barest essentials, a sack of flour, some salt, perhaps oil, and leave with his coins stacked neatly on the counter. No one ever asked where those coins had come from, but it was not just Elijah. Each member of the Harper clan seemed marked in their own way. His younger brother Amos was said to carry a permanent scowl, his fists quick to rise even in silence. Their sister Ruth seldom lifted her eyes, yet always seemed to watch from shadows. And then there were the Harper children, thin as rails yet oddly expressionless, as though taught from birth that words and warmth were dangerous indulgences. Together they formed a picture not of a family, but of creatures bound by survival, molded into something less than human, or perhaps more dangerous than human itself. Winter swept across Missouri with harsh winds that year, and with it, the rumors grew so loud they could not be ignored. Travelers vanished with alarming regularity. A young couple, newlywed and ambitious, set west for Kansas and were never seen again. A peddler carrying silver charms, last spotted selling trinkets near the township, simply disappeared. And then one night, smoke was seen rising high from the Harper land, too thick to be from wood alone. A few watched from a distance, claiming the air itself carried a smell they would never forget, a smell too foul to be anything but burning flesh. Men gathered the next day in town to discuss whether something ought to be done, but meetings turned into nervous silences and arguments fell apart. For who among them would lead the way to that haunted farm? The fear was not merely of rifles or shotguns, it was of what might truly be found within the Harper walls. In time a story emerged, whispered with horror, of what had happened to one of the Harper children. It was said that one winter, food grew so thin that Elijah himself made a choice. A child too young to work, too weak to carry, too small to feed from the land was said to have gone missing. No body was found, no burial ever seen. But neighbors swore that afterward. There were bones behind the farmhouse, and meat served on plates that looked far too plentiful for a starving farm. Though no one could prove it, the thought lingered and grew until even the boldest men refused to hunt near those woods. What kind of family, they asked themselves, would not only devour strangers but consume its own blood? Thus the Harpers became not merely a name but a curse. To speak of them was to invoke dread, and to step onto their land was to risk never leaving. Yet for all the talk, no proof was ever carried into the open. Only shadows, whispers, and the growing conviction that what lived in that crooked farmhouse was not bound by any law of God, man, or decency, and still they remained. Surviving as others starved, appearing in town with coin as neighbors went broke, and lurking like specters in the hills where Missouri grew dark. For those who hoped the legend was no more than rumor, time would soon dash their illusions. For every horror hides a moment when whispers give way to truth, and the Harper family's reckoning was drawing closer with every passing night. By the first months of 1884, the pattern could no longer be ignored. The roads that wound through that part of Missouri had become known not as passages of travel, but of disappearance. Word spread quickly along stage routes, carried by drivers, peddlers, and vagabonds from town to town. If your journey passed too near the Harper homestead, you ran a risk greater than highwaymen, greater even than storms. You risked never emerging again. It was a chilling reputation that grew not from a single incident, but from dozens of accounts stitched together into one unshakable truth. Wagon tracks leading toward the hills, but none coming back out. Travelers last seen sharing a drink in a nearby town, never reaching the next one. Belongings found carelessly discarded along the roads, as though stripped in haste. And worse, bodies. Not many, but enough. Some washed up in shallow creeks, their flesh marked by cuts too deliberate to be mistaken for an animal attack. Others buried shallowly, discovered by hunters when the thaw came, their remains gnawed in ways no one dared to imagine aloud. These discoveries were not frequent, but frequent enough to give every rumor an anchor in reality. It was then that the Harper family's name spread farther than ever before. No longer merely whispered in Missouri towns, their reputation began to seep across borders, into Arkansas, into Kansas, into Illinois. What had once been a local tale of dread now grew into something larger, a story repeated around campfires by travelers who had only half a grain of proof. But as is so often the case, it was not proof that mattered, it was the fear. Among the most unnerving aspects of the Harpers was their invisibility amid their own notoriety. They remained almost untouched by law. No sheriff's posse marched upon their land. No warrants were drawn, no arrests made. The fear surrounding their household seemed to extend even to those sworn to uphold justice. For every story of horror there was the quiet, pressing reality. The Harper clan was large, fiercely loyal, and armed. To challenge them could mean a bloodbath, and in those isolated hills who would ride for help even if one dared? Still, traces of evidence trickled in. Farmers whose land bordered theirs spoke of strange noises in the night. The barking of dogs cut short, followed by silence too deep to be ignored. Gunshots that echoed against the hills then faded, leaving an uneasy hush, and sometimes the acrid smell of smoke drifting across the fields, carried by the wind, so potent it seemed to cling to clothing and skin. They burn what they cannot bury, some said, and though no one wished to know what it was they burned, the implication lingered heavily. For Elijah Harper and his clan, life continued with grim regularity. They labored just enough to mask themselves as farmers, but their land yielded little worth boasting about. Their true sustenance, it seemed, lay elsewhere, taken not from soil or pen but from man. The stories claimed Elijah had developed a method, a system of luring. Strangers would be offered shelter when passing that lonely route, a place to warm themselves, to eat, even to share drink. The Harpers, with stiff politeness, would welcome them, but it was a welcome that hid intent darker than robbery. For in the morning, those travelers were never seen again, their wagons and possessions swallowed into the barns, their flesh never spoken of but deeply suspected. And if rumor already made the Harpers a household name of horror, there came then a tale so awful it sealed their infamy. It was centered not on strangers, but on themselves. Winter of 1884 was one of the cruelest in memory. Frost bit deep into the hills, livestock died in droves, and families across Missouri shivered by their hearths, praying their food stores would last. Hunger gnawed at every community. It was then, according to murmured testimony, that the Harpers turned on their own blood once more. The story concerned Amos Harper's youngest boy. Barely 7 years old, he had been delicate from birth, often sick, too weak to labor in the fields. Such children, in those days, were sometimes seen as burdens on struggling farms. Yet what the Harpers did, if the whispers hold truth, was far worse than neglect. When rations dwindled to almost nothing, and when Elijah sought to impose grim order upon his clan, it was the boy who vanished. No burial, no grave. His cousins never saw him again, yet within days neighbors swore the family looked fed, healthier than hunger should have allowed. It was an act that, if true, cemented the Harper reputation, not merely as killers of travelers, but as devourers of kin. How much was true, and how much invention, no outsider could ever fully say. Legends grow fat in hungry times, but what spread across Missouri was not merely a tale, it was a certainty painted with the brush of fear. Parents frightened children with warnings. Keep quiet or the Harpers will take you. Strangers traveling those roads were told to ride quickly or not at all. And more than one preacher thundered from his pulpit that the Harper clan was proof of what men become when they cast off God's law. Beasts with human faces, twisting family into hunger and home into slaughter. Perhaps the most striking testimony came from a man who claimed to have escaped. He was a drifter, nameless in most accounts, but his story spread like fire. He swore he had been offered shelter by the Harpers on a freezing night, half-starved and desperate. At first he was shown warmth, a fire in the hearth, a plate of food. Too much food, he said, for a family so plainly poor. The meat was tough, stringy, but he ate with the hunger of a man who hadn't known a real meal in weeks. Only when he rested by the fire did he realize the stares upon him. Elijah watching too closely, Amos gripping a knife at his belt, the children whispering from the stairs. His account ended with a frantic escape. He claimed he bolted through the door in the night, chased by gunshots that missed him by inches, running until dawn. When he reached the next town, clothes torn and bleeding from thorns, he had just one thing to say, that the Harper family's hospitality was a trap, and that the meat they fed him had not been pork nor beef, nor any game the woods could provide. Not everyone believed him. But enough did, and the weight of such a story was heavy enough to anchor every whisper. If even half of it were real, what manner of evil thrived in those hills? By spring of that year, The Harpers had become more legend than flesh. They seemed less like neighbors or kin, and more like predators haunting the roads, their homestead painted in the public mind as a place where no light reached. Riders avoided their stretch of land entirely. Even the sheriff, when pressed, admitted quietly that the Harpers were best left alone, but tales as dark as theirs do not fade. They fester, and each passing season drew the inevitable closer. Every empire of silence eventually crumbles, for truth cannot be buried forever. And so as the Harper legend grew, so too did the murmurs of reckoning. Farmers whispered of forming a posse, though few dared lead it. Ministers called upon law to act, though no man placed his hand upon Elijah. Yet the weight of blood cannot hide forever, and deep in those hills, as spring rains fed the earth and wildflowers bloomed again, there lingered a sense felt by all who spoke the Harper name, that time was short. Their deeds, whispered, suspected, half-known, would not lie buried. The hills themselves seemed to hold their breath, for horror waits, and when it bursts it does so fully. The vanishing roads had become more than trails swallowed by woods. They had become an omen, and those who lived in the shadow of the Harpers knew, one way or another, that judgment was on its way. By the summer of 1884, Missouri had grown weary of whispers. The Harper name, once a murmur tucked into corners of saloons and church pews, had become something heavier. It weighed on parents who kept their children from wandering. It hung over travelers who chose longer roads to avoid the hills. And most of all, it pressed upon the men sworn to uphold order, shaming them into silence. For it was no secret that lawmen avoided the Harpers. Though suspicions piled like stones, evidence remained scarce. And worse, fear kept even the bravest from stepping foot onto their land. A sheriff could call for order in town, but what weight did that hold in the wild country, where rifles spoke louder than badges? And what force could truly dismantle a clan as numerous, armed, and secretive as the Harpers? One sheriff, William McGraw, carried that burden heavier than most. Based in a township not far from the Harper land, he had grown tired of the families who approached him in whispers, desperate for answers about missing kin. A brother overdue on his journey west, a merchant who never returned with goods, a farmhand expected to arrive, but vanished before reaching the next farm. Each story seemed to point always in the same direction, toward that crooked homestead with sagging walls and a silence thicker than sin. McGraw was no coward, but he was no fool. He knew the Harpers could not be challenged lightly. Elijah was a man whose word ran like iron inside his household, and rumor said he kept not just rifles but pistols and blades scattered within arm's reach in every room of the farmhouse. If lawmen entered, they might not leave. Posse or no posse, evidence or not, a confrontation would ignite bloodshed. Still, McGraw felt the pressure mounting, the eyes of a fearful county fixed squarely upon him. And though he could not yet move against them, he began to prepare. Meanwhile, the legend tightened its claws. Farmers tending their fields swore they saw movements on the horizon, shapes lurking on hills at twilight, watching, then vanishing when called. Riders claimed to hear their own names whispered from the woods, though no throat could have uttered them. The Harpers themselves were seldom seen, but when they were, their presence stirred unease. Whole saloons fell quiet when Elijah entered, men drinking nervously, women looking away. His family, silent shadows around him, made it seem less an arrival than an occupation. It was during that season that the most damning rumor of all emerged, pushed along by the lips of those who claimed too much knowledge to be ignored. The Harpers, it was said, had devised a new method of trapping their prey. No longer did they only rely upon chance travelers wandering near. Now they were said to offer lodging at a price so cheap it drew in the desperate. A barn, a bed, a meal, enough to lure weary men from the road. They would never depart with morning light. One account told of a pair of young brothers, farmhands traveling west to seek work in Kansas. They were spotted one afternoon in a town bordering the Harper territory, laughing, sharing drink. They spoke openly of resting overnight at a farm along the road. That farm, many believed, could have been none other than the Harper spread. Neither brother was ever seen again. Their employer waited in vain. Their families never received word, and though the sheriff searched, turning up only a shattered pocket watch near a muddy trail, no bodies surfaced. No belongings beyond that, just absence, always absence. By then the word cannibal was not whispered but spoken, It carried through parlor rooms in hushed conversations, drifted across back porches with the smoke of pipes, and echoed through the minds of anyone traveling the lonely Missouri roads. Not merely killers, the Harper family was said to feed upon their victims, turning their farmhouse into a slaughterhouse and their kitchen table into a grotesque theater of hunger. And worst of all, the story persisted that they had consumed even their own. The strength of the legend no longer rested solely on horror, but on plausibility, for hunger was real. Times were lean, and human desperation knows no boundary when survival demands sacrifice. If any family could be capable of crossing that line, it was the Harpers. Sheriff McGraw, aware of these stories but bound by law, began to watch for opportunity. He could not storm the homestead without evidence, but he could prepare, speak quietly with neighboring farmers, gather men of strong conscience and watch the roads more closely than ever. Too many had vanished, and if the Harpers were guilty, they would slip eventually. Like all predators, their hunger would betray them. The Harper farm, meanwhile, remained eerily unchanged. Its roof sagged, its boards rattled in the wind, its paint long since stripped by rain and sun. Livestock still clung to life within its pens, though thinner than proper care would allow. The family moved between house and barn like phantoms, seldom laughing, seldom showing any outward sign of joy. Only the smoke from their chimneys spoke of life within, and neighbors swore, when the wind turned just so, that the smell it carried was not of pork, nor beef, nor any earthly game. By evening, some claimed they saw lanterns glowing behind curtains well past midnight. Others swore they heard voices raised in anger, arguments too vicious to belong to kin, and often cries cut through the hills, cries uncertain in origin, uncertain in species, but carrying the desperate tone of something alive pleading to remain so. And yet, the Harpers endured, untouched. Perhaps that was what made their horror most chilling. For evil is frightening when it hides, but it is far worse when it lives openly, its violence suspected but never stopped, its mere presence enough to silence those who might stand against it. The balance, however, could not last. Missouri pride would not suffer such shadows forever, and though Sheriff McGraw lacked the power to strike quickly, he gathered resolve with each new disappearance. Neighbors grew restless. Fathers clenched fists. Preachers condemned from pulpits what no sheriff yet dared punish. And so, as that year wore into its late months, a new sense of inevitability spread across the hills. People believed the Harpers' day would come, not through witness accounts nor through careful law, but through weight of rumor itself. Legends, after all, can spark action as swiftly as truth. All that was required was a spark, a single act too vile to ignore, a body too undeniable, a disappearance too brazen. From then, truth would emerge and fire would follow. For years, the Harpers had thrived in shadows, drowning suspicion in silence, swallowing evidence in smoke. But such shadows slip when the night grows thin, and in the fading days of 1884, even Elijah Harper could not hold the darkness forever. Autumn of 1884 settled heavily upon Missouri, the trees burning red and gold before the harsh winds stripped them bare. By then, for many counties, the name Harper was no longer rumor but warning. Travelers avoided those hills altogether. Families kept to themselves, locking doors even when no stranger roamed. The Harper land had become a stain on the map, a shadow among farms, a place unspoken even in daylight. Yet shadows, no matter how dark, cannot eclipse light forever. And it was in that season that an event unfolded, one disappearance too severe, too public, too undeniable, that struck the heart of every whisper and forced truth into the open. The man was not a drifter. He was not a stranger wandering a lonely road. He was a respected merchant, a man of standing and trust, known by nearly every township within a day's ride. His name was Thomas Keller, and unlike the nameless souls who had vanished before him, he was a man people counted on, a figure whose absence demanded answers. Keller had traveled those hills for years, bringing goods from St. Louis across Missouri's rural expanse. Often he carried fabrics, tools, liquor, and books, items coveted in the smaller towns where luxuries rarely reached. He knew the dangers of bandits and frost, but he also knew the people. Always careful, always deliberate, he traveled at steady pace, never rushing, never courting trouble. And so when Keller vanished on the route that wound near the Harper property, there was no easy excuse to offer in his place. He was last seen in town 3 miles from the Harper spread, his wagon heavy with wares. He dined with locals that night, his ledger marked neatly, every sale accounted for. He told the tavern keeper he would ride before dawn to reach the next stop before midday. The next morning, his tracks were found leading along the road toward the hills. Beyond that point, silence. His wagon never arrived, his horse never reappeared, and Keller himself, reliable, steadfast Keller, was swallowed whole as if the earth itself had opened to take him. This disappearance was different. Drifters might be forgotten, farmhands might be overlooked, but Keller was a man of the community, and communities do not forget their own. Alarm spread like wildfire. Merchants refused to travel until answers came. Families demanded the sheriff act. Even those too timid to confront the Harpers now understood. The whispers of evil hidden in those hills had grown into something too large to bury. Sheriff McGraw, cornered at last by truth laid bare, could not delay further. He summoned men he trusted, farmers, shopkeepers, men with families of their own, and asked them to ride with him. Some resisted, fear knotting their stomachs. Others clenched fists, ready to bring justice no matter how rough. In the end, a posse was formed, each man swearing to find what had become of Keller, evidence or no evidence, Harper or no Harper. For the hills could not go on unsilenced. When the posse rode, neighbors watched from porches, silent, tense, as though the law itself were walking into a den of wolves. The path began calm, the autumn light pale, but as they drew nearer to the Harper land, unease set thick upon them. The very trees seemed twisted, the fields tired and barren, the ground marked by years of neglect. The Harper farmhouse loomed at last, its crooked roof and leaning boards as grotesque as the rumors surrounding it. Smoke curled from its chimney, slow and heavy. The men approached with rifles ready, Sheriff McGraw riding at their head. He called out Elijah's name, his voice stern but steady. For several moments there was no answer, only the sound of the wind brushing through brittle cornstalks nearby. Then at last the door opened, and Elijah Harper himself emerged. He stood tall, his face stony, his eyes cold and fixed upon the men, as though daring them to step closer. Behind him shadows moved, faces half seen, women and children peering through cracks in the doorway. The clan lurked like animals in dens, unblinking, waiting. McGraw spoke of Keller, of his disappearance, of the trail that led to their land, of the community's demand for answers. Elijah did not shift, did not blink. His reply, when it came, was steady as iron. He claimed ignorance, said no man had passed their farm in days, and demanded the sheriff take his men off private land. His voice carried the threat of rifles hidden within, the weight of violence unspoken yet certain. The posse hesitated. Each man could feel the tension cut deep in their bones. They stood on the threshold of horror, knowing a single step could ignite bloodshed. McGraw ordered to search the land, and Elijah's hand twitched toward his belt. For a moment the world shrank to silence, the kind of silence before storms. But then, before violence erupted, McGraw caught sight of something. It was the wagon. Beyond the barn, half hidden under weathered canvas, the unmistakable frame of Keller's merchant wagon stood. Its paint scarred, its wheels muddy, it could not be mistaken. McGraw called it out, pointing sharply, demanding explanation. Elijah turned, slow, his voice colder than ever. The wagon, he claimed, was bought fairly, traded to them by a passing man weeks before. But McGraw knew it was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. The wagon was Keller's, brought into town yearly, carved initials on its side matching his hand. The posse broke into shouts. Some demanded to break the barn doors. Some wanted blood. Elijah barked his own order, and from the shadows rifles glinted. The standoff tightened. What broke the moment, however, was not gunfire, but smell. One of the men standing downwind of the farmhouse stiffened suddenly. The air carried with it a stench, thick, undeniable, familiar to any who had charred meat over fires. Only this was not hog flesh, nor beef, nor any honest cut. It was sweet and foul all at once, a rot that seized the stomach and clawed at the mind. The men recognized it at once, though none dared speak the word. The stench of burning flesh. The Harper clan did not flinch, though. To them it seemed a silence rehearsed, as though they were long accustomed to that odor, as though their senses had buried its meaning. But the posse could not bury it. Not anymore. That day bloodshed was avoided by the thinnest margin. McGraw and his men withdrew, rifles still ready, threatening to return with more law and more men. Elijah watched them leave, his jaw set, his face etched with something between contempt and amusement. But the truth had been seen now. Keller was gone. His wagon was hidden at their farm, and the air itself carried accusations stronger than any words spoken. When the posse returned to town, their account needed no exaggeration. Parents wept, merchants cursed, and preachers declared the Harpers beyond redemption. Rumor no longer held sway. Evidence had stepped into daylight, undeniable, real, foul in both sight and smell. The reckoning was no longer distant. It was coming. And for the first time since their name first rose into whispers, the Harper clan could feel it pressing upon them, not as rumor, not as shadow, but as fire at their doorstep. The days following the discovery of Thomas Keller's wagon were heavy with unease. Towns across the county seemed to live under a single shadow, restless and charged with something unspoken. It was no longer merely rumor or whisper. It was trust shattered, dignity wounded, and fear turned rancid inside a community that could no longer turn its eyes away. No man doubted what had been seen. The wagon was Keller's. The stench that carried from the Harper land had been no hog meat, no innocent fire. The silence of Elijah and his clan had sealed their guilt. Some details remained shrouded, but the broad truth was clear. Thomas Keller had not vanished into some wayward wilderness. He had been here on Harper property, and he had not left alive. The townsfolk, once careful not to speak the Harper name too loudly, now spat it openly, some with trembling fear, others with furious conviction. Women pressed hands over their children's ears as men in saloons called for vengeance. Farmers at market muttered of rough justice, of ending a curse once and for all. Preachers denounced Elijah as a demon in man's skin, warning their congregations that evil flourished in silence, and silence had lasted far too long. Yet within that surge of anger came hesitation. Men differed wildly in their response. Some demanded immediate action, form the posse again, ride at dawn, and put fire to the Harper house until nothing remained. Others begged for caution, warning that Elijah had rifles, that his clan was large and desperate, and that riding in unprepared meant walking straight into slaughter. The county divided itself into two camps, those who sought swift violence and those who feared it. Sheriff McGraw felt the full weight of that division upon his shoulders. He had ridden to the Harper farm once already, had stared into Elijah's unblinking eyes, had felt the tension of rifles waiting inside. He knew the danger. He also knew that if nothing was done, his own name would rot forever alongside the Harpers. It was the burden of law in the wilderness, act no matter the cost. Quietly, McGraw began his work. He spoke one by one to the men he trusted most, those with steady nerves and steady rifles. He visited farms late at night, leaving only after long whispers by firelight. Not all agreed, not all accepted, but those who did pledged themselves, not for gold or reputation, but for dignity, for the safety of their wives and children, for the right to move again along the county roads without looking over their shoulder. Meanwhile, the Harper homestead lay in silence, but it was a silence that brimmed with preparation. Neighbors too close to the land claimed to hear the sound of hammering on certain nights, as if boards were being reinforced, walls stiffened. Sheds once sagging were said to groan with new weight, perhaps hidden supplies, perhaps munitions. And always, the smoke from the chimney, thick, dark, unrelenting, stirred the wind with the memory of Keller and all the others who had never returned. When Elijah came to town days after the confrontation, the atmosphere froze. He arrived in broad daylight, flanked by Amos and Ruth, his expression as steady and cold as stone. He bought salt and lamp oil from the general store, setting gold coin on the counter, the same way he always had. Yet this time whispers burned louder than before. The townsfolk stared, lips set tight, hands drifting near belts and rifles, yet none dared move. They watched as Elijah pocketed his change, turned without a word, and walked back into that cursed horizon. It was Defiance, plain as day. He was telling them nothing had changed, but everything had changed that very evening. In the back room of the sheriff's office, men gathered with solemn faces, their rifles propped against walls. McGraw addressed them, his voice low but unwavering. He spoke of Keller, of justice, of the law that had been mocked under their very noses. He did not preach revenge. He demanded order, the restoration of something human against a family that had denied its humanity. Some of the men trembled, Some clenched their fists, some whispered prayers under their breath, but all agreed the time had come. The posse would ride again, this time not to warn but to end. Word spread quietly, though never fully secret. Families knew their sons and husbands would ride. Neighbors knew which men gathered rifles into wagons. Women wept silently, fears of violence thick upon their hearts. Some begged their husbands to stay home, fearing that Elijah's rifles would mow them down like stalks. But the men who had agreed to ride could not be swayed. To cower longer was to surrender their community to darkness. That night, the town was alive with an unease so sharp it trembled windows. Lamps burned later than usual. Voices whispered at thresholds, dogs barked endlessly at shadows. In the fields beyond, owls hooted low, and the harvest moon hung orange in the sky, casting long, eerie silhouettes against the earth. And on the Harper land, witnesses swore strange movements stirred. Lanterns lit and shifted from room to room deeper into the night. Barn doors slammed, shapes passed across curtained windows. Some claimed to hear distant laughter, others screams. Whatever the truth, the Harper household seemed aware that something was coming. Perhaps they had caught wind of the gathering, perhaps their instinct warned them. Predators know when hunters draw near. By the time dawn approached, the posse was ready. 20 men in all, rifles slung across their shoulders, revolvers at belts, their horses stomping nervously, as if aware of the task ahead. Sheriff McGraw rode at their lead, jaw set firm, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where the hills waited. Nobody spoke much. Silence carried heavier than words. The road to the Harper farm seemed longer than ever that morning, each turn heavy with the knowledge of what awaited. For these were not scenes from stories or rumors whispered in saloons. They were flesh and blood men, riding toward flesh and blood evil, each step pushing them deeper into a reckoning some might not survive. Behind them, townsfolk watched from porches, some crying openly, some cheering. Others stayed hidden inside, unwilling to see. For whatever lay ahead, one truth was certain. This day would not end the way it had before. There would be no warnings, no retreat. This was the hour when whispers turned into gunfire, when rumor gave way to reality, and on the Harper land, the crooked farmhouse waited, its walls sagging, its windows dark as eyes, its shadow stretched across the earth, daring the world to enter. The men knew as they rode closer, that history itself now bent under their boots. Somewhere inside that house the answers lay. How many had died, how many had been buried, how many horrors had lived unchecked. And somewhere in those boards and barns, a family waited, a family that had traded love for hunger, kinship for cruelty, survival for savagery. The hills of Missouri had whispered for years. Soon they would roar, for this was no longer a story of avoidance nor of rumors drifting on winds. It was a reckoning long starved, and now at last unleashed. The Harper farmhouse stood on the ridge like a wound upon the land. Its weather-beaten boards leaned under time's weight, its crooked roof drooped heavy with years of neglect, its dark windows staring out upon the hills like lifeless eyes. For decades it had been a place of quiet horror, rumors and whispers feeding its shadow. But on that morning, as the posse drew within sight, silence itself grew thick, suffocating and charged with a violence that had not yet broken. It was the last silence before reckoning. Sheriff William McGraw reined in his horse atop the slope, overlooking the Harper spread. 20 men sat behind him, their figures tense, rifles gripped tight, faces carved with the knowledge that none of them rode merely as farmers or merchants now. They rode as witnesses, as executioners, as men carrying the law upon their own shoulders. The air hung cool and brittle, the dawn sun breaking weakly through mist that clung over the fields. Ahead the farmhouse showed no movement. Yet the men knew with chilling certainty that eyes were upon them. From behind curtains or cracks between boards, from the dark slits of the barn, the Harper family was watching, waiting. The house seemed alive in that moment, not as a shelter but as a beast coiled upon itself, daring them to step closer. The riders dismounted slowly, tying their horses to fence posts that sagged with rot. Boots crunched on frost-hardened soil. A stray crow cut through the sky in jagged flight, the only sound above the wind's low whisper. Most of the men had hunted in their lives and all felt it, the sensation of walking prey into a corner, the taut awareness before something wild lashes out. Only this was no animal. This was a family of flesh and mind, human in form, monstrous in deed. McGraw gathered the men in a half-circle, his voice hushed, each word carrying the weight of command. We go careful. We give them one chance to come out. If they refuse— He paused, his eyes heavy, moving from face to face. Then we end it. The men nodded, silent. Some adjusted their grips on rifles. Others flexed nervous fingers against the triggers of revolvers. The youngest among them, barely 20, swallowed hard, his face pale. The oldest, a scarred Civil War veteran, spat into the dirt and muttered, "Best this be finished today." They advanced, boots treading the rutted path toward the farmhouse. Each step seemed to echo louder than it should, as though the earth itself felt the weight of what was coming. The nearer they drew, the heavier the odor of smoke drifted across the air. Not the thick sweetness of pork or beef, but the acrid, nauseating scent that had haunted every whisper. It clung to their throats, turning stomachs with a certainty no words could deny. Whatever the Harpers had done, it had not ended with Thomas Keller. When they reached the yard, McGraw raised his hand. The men formed a line, rifles leveled. He stepped forward, standing just beyond the warped porch. His voice rose strong, breaking the heavy stillness. "Elijah Harper, by the authority of this county, you and yours are ordered to step outside. Hands where we can see 'em." For a moment nothing stirred. The windows remained dark, the door shut tight. The only sound was the wind brushing across the brittle fields. The silence deepened. Not the silence of emptiness, but that awful quiet right before a match is struck. Then a shift. A curtain twitched in an upstairs window. A shadow moved across the glass, then retreated. Another appeared, shorter, thinner, a child perhaps, peering nervously, then vanishing behind the boards. Within, voices hushed, the creak of footsteps on old wood carrying faintly across the porch. McGraw called again, this time louder, his tone sharpening. "Elijah, this is your last chance. Come outside, now." The hinges groaned. Slowly, painfully, the front door began to open. Out stepped Elijah Harper. He was just as McGraw remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, his weathered face unreadable, his dark eyes as hard as wrought iron. His beard, streaked grey, looked untended, his coat patched and faded. Yet it was not neglect that made him frightening, it was composure. Even now, flanked by 20 rifles, Elijah walked forward with a calm that chilled bone. He stopped at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, gazing down at McGraw and the men without a flicker of fear. For a long stretch, no one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Elijah's voice came, low and steady. "You've no place here, Sheriff. My land, my blood. You come closer, some of you won't leave alive." McGraw stood firm. "Where's Keller?" he demanded. "Where's his wagon, his goods, his body?" Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Man came and went. Not our concern." The lies cut sharp. McGraw felt rage stir in his gut, but he held steady. Behind Elijah, more shadows had gathered in the doorway. Amos, broad and scowling, clutching a rifle. Ruth, pale and thin, her face hidden beneath a kerchief. The children, their eyes eerie with silence. They stood crowded like wolves behind their alpha, watching. The men behind McGraw shifted uneasily. Fingers tensed on triggers. One coughed nervously. Another muttered a prayer. The Harper family remained still as a coiled snake. McGraw lifted his voice once more. "Elijah Harper, in the name of the law, I order you and every last one of your kin to surrender yourselves. This land is surrounded. There'll be no running this time." For a fleeting second, it seemed Elijah might answer. His jaw tightened. His chest rose as though drawing breath for words. Then he did something else. Slowly, deliberately, his arms unfolded, and his hand dropped to his side. His fingers touched the stock of the rifle leaning against the porch rail. The posse jolted. Bolts clicked. The air quivered. Eyes widened. And for the briefest heartbeat, the hills of Missouri sat balanced on the edge of a single choice: surrender or slaughter, obedience or carnage. But Elijah Harper did not surrender. His lips twisted, not into a grin, not into anger, but into something far worse, a calm acceptance, as though all along this reckoning had been inevitable, and he was ready to meet it. The silence stretched into eternity. The only sound left was the wind sighing low through the fields. The men knew in their bones what was about to come. They could feel the string pulled taut, ready to snap. the storm gathering on the horizon ready to split the sky with thunder. It had taken years for the whispers to rise to this point. Years of silence, of missing men, of smoke from chimneys that smelled of death. And now in this very moment, the silence would shatter. The Harper farmhouse was no longer just a house. It was a fortress, a graveyard, a trap, and within its sagging walls, a family long estranged from humanity waited to make their final stand. At the edge of the porch, Elijah's hand tightened. Sheriff McGraw's voice dropped to a growl. "Don't do it, Elijah." But in Elijah's eyes burned something unyielding. Not desperation, not madness, conviction. He would not bend, not to law, not to fear, not to the world itself. And as the sheriff drew breath to speak again, the earth itself seemed to hold still. The storm was seconds away. The tension broke not with words, nor with surrender, nor with reason. It broke with the crack of a rifle, sudden, sharp, and final. No man would later agree who fired the first shot. Some swore it was Elijah, his finger tightening around the stock, his voice still too calm for any law to control. Others believed a nervous farmer in the posse lost his will, panic pulling the trigger before thought could intervene. Whatever the truth, the sound tore across the hillside like thunder, and once it rang, no power on earth could call it back. The Harper homestead erupted in fury. From the windows, from the doorways, from slits between warped boards, gunfire spat like lightning. The air filled at once with smoke and lead. Bullets tore into the fence posts where the posse crouched, splintering wood into sharp fragments. Horses screamed and reared. One fell, gunned down before it could break free of its tether. Men shouted, ducked, and scrambled for cover in the yard's uneven ground. The open silence of dawn collapsed into a chaos so violent that every heartbeat became a question of survival. Sheriff McGraw barked orders, voice hoarse but iron. "Hold the line! Keep low!" Rifle raised, he fired back at the porch, the report echoing through the fields. Around him the men fired in uneven bursts, smoke curling upward into the pale morning sky. The farmhouse absorbed the first volleys stubbornly, its thick timbers and warped boards shielding those within. The Harpers had long prepared for this moment, and now their stronghold proved it. Elijah himself stood like a shadow in the doorway, rifle cracking again and again, with the rhythm of a man long practiced at war in silence. Each shot was measured, deliberate, and pitiless. His brother Amos leaned from a side window, buckshot tearing across the yard with wild ferocity, forcing men down behind broken fences and fallen barrels. Behind them, other Harper kin shouted in fury, voices overlapping, the sound animal in its rage. Even Ruth, once thought quiet and meek, was seen hefting a pistol with both hands, her pale face twisted in defiance. The posse, shaken but determined, pressed forward. They crawled and scrambled through the dirt, rifles cracking in reply, bullets smashing glass, chewing into siding, exploding through shutters. One man fell, struck in the chest, his cry wrenched from him before silence stole it for good. Another took a bullet in the shoulder, his rifle slipping useless from his grasp as blood spread dark across his coat. Fear gnawed at the line, but rage kept it rooted. Rage for Keller, for every vanishing, for every year of silence swallowed by the hills. The Harper children screamed from inside, their voices sharp, echoing like wild birds trapped in a cage. Some clutched firearms too large for their frail arms, firing wildly at shapes beyond the glass. Others huddled in corners, eyes wide with something not innocence but indoctrination, the eerie silence of those raised to know only hunger and violence. At one point, Amos burst from the side door, shotgun raised, charging recklessly toward the men. He let off 2 blasts, smoke billowing as shot rained across fence rails. But before he could reload, 3 rifles cracked in unison, tearing him backward into the dirt. His body thudded to the ground, chest shattered, his hand twitching once before stilling. The death ignited the Harpers further. Ruth shrieked, her voice carrying across the fields like a banshee's wail. Gunfire doubled from the windows. Elijah, unshaken even by his brother's fall, reloaded smoothly, his rifle popping off another round that dropped one of McGraw's men to his knees. Blood soaked the grass beneath him as he gasped and toppled. McGraw pressed his men forward. A group broke toward the barn, hugging low behind water troughs and wood piles, rifles blazing as they crawled closer. Their goal was clear: flank the farmhouse, force the Harpers to draw back from the windows. Each yard forward, however, came at a cost. A bullet slammed into one man's thigh. Another grazed a cheek with a red streak. Yet momentum carried them until at last they reached the side, slamming their shoulders against the barn wall. Inside, the muffled sounds of chains rattled, animals, or perhaps not animals, restless and lowing. Meanwhile, the front yard became a war of attrition. Smoke lay heavy now, curling blue-grey across the porch, filtering through broken shutters. The ground was littered with shattered boards and streaks of red where men had fallen. McGraw shouted above the din, his revolver barking shot after shot toward the figures that dared appear in broken windows. And yet the Harpers fought with a desperation that was more than mere defense. They were not simply holding ground. They were dragging every last man into their hunger-driven defiance. A sudden cry split the yard. One of the posse's youngest, a boy of 20, rose too quickly, his nerves frayed. A rifle cracked from the porch. The boy fell in an instant, his body twitching once in the dust before going still. His blood pooled dark, soaking into the earth stained by years of sin. McGraw's jaw clenched as he watched, rage surging within him. He raised his revolver, firing straight at Elijah's outline. The shot shattered the wooden post beside Elijah's head, but the man did not flinch. He swung his rifle, let off a blast, and vanished once more into shadow. The fight dragged into minutes that felt like lifetimes. Ammunition thinned. Smoke thickened. Men's ears rang with the constant roar. Cries echoed from both sides, punctured by silence as another life ended with lead. The farmhouse groaned under the onslaught. Glass shattered, siding splintered, doors blown at the hinges. But still the Harpers did not yield. At last fire answered fire. One of McGraw's men tore a lantern from his pack, lit with trembling hands, and hurled it against the side of the farmhouse. Flames bloomed instantly, licking up dry timbers, feeding hungrily as if the house itself had awaited its own burning. The smoke changed from grey to black, churning thick into the sky. The response inside was madness. Screams ripped from the walls, windows flung open as the Harpers fired in every direction. Some tried to burst through the front door, but the posse met them with rifles unmerciful. One Harper boy fell into the dirt, writhing as blood pooled beneath him. Another staggered, firing wildly before collapsing near the porch steps. Still Elijah remained. Framed by firelight from within, he stood in the doorway, rifle clutched as though it were part of him. His eyes burned, not with fear, not with surrender, but with that same unrelenting defiance he had carried from the first. He roared something, words lost beneath the crackle of fire and the storm of gunshot, and lifted his weapon one final time. Bullets answered him. 3 struck his chest in quick succession. His body jerked back, his rifle clattering from his grip before he collapsed across the threshold, half inside, half out, like a sentinel toppled at the gates. The farmhouse became an inferno. Flames consumed the walls, the roof sagged and caved, timbers shrieking as they split apart. The screams dwindled, the gunfire slowed until only the roar of fire remained. Men stepped back, smoke choking their throats, eyes stinging, hearts pounding with the knowledge of what they had endured, what they had witnessed. The Harper family, the curse of the Missouri hills, was no more. Their house burned not just as firewood, but as an exorcism, the land itself seeming to groan as years of silence and suffering went up in flames. The posse stood scattered, battered, bloodied. Some dropped to their knees from exhaustion. Others wept silently for the men lost, the friends fallen. Sheriff McGraw stood unmoving, his revolver still in hand, staring at the dying fire as if daring it to reveal the truth hidden within its walls. For within that farmhouse lay the answers, the flesh, the bones the horrors whispered for years. And though the flames swallowed much, enough would remain to tell the world. Morning light cut through the smoke like pale blades. The farmhouse was no longer a structure, but a smouldering ruin, its timbers collapsing inward, its embers glowing red against blackened beams. The Harpers' cries had ceased, their defiance ended in flame and lead. Where once there had been whispered terror hidden in the hills, there now remained only the silence of death and the acrid stench of burning wood and flesh. The posse stood scattered across the yard, their faces grey with fatigue and ash. Some lowered rifles with trembling hands. Others stared hollow-eyed into the flames that devoured what had once been both home and prison. They had survived, though at a cost. 3 of their number lay dead in the dirt, their bodies covered with hastily torn cloth, while several more clutched wounds seeping dark. Yet in every man's eyes burned the same grim awareness. The battle had ended, but the horror was still waiting to be unearthed. Sheriff McGraw, streaking his jaw, moved slowly toward the farmhouse remains. The roof had caved, the structure sagged inward, but some rooms still showed their skeletons through the smoke. He motioned for a few men to follow. "And we need to see," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to know." What they found inside hollowed their stomachs and froze the marrow in their bones. The first room they entered was the kitchen, its walls blackened, rafters dripping with soot. The long wooden table lay half-burned, yet untouched enough to tell its story. Plates were scattered across it, some charred, others intact. On them remained scraps of meat, roasted and half-devoured, their edges blackened from fire but still unmistakably wrong. The cuts were odd, irregular, stripped from joints that no butcher would recognize. Beside them were bones, longer than any hog's, thinner than beef, their marrow cracked and hollow. The men stared in wordless shock, each of them understanding before a single word was spoken. One man turned and vomited into the ash. Another pressed a hand to his mouth, his eyes wet, shaking his head as though denial might erase what stood before them. McGraw himself swallowed hard, his fists clenched, forcing himself to remain. The rumors had not been exaggerations. They had been truths, truths too ugly to speak. Farther inside, amid smoldering beams, more evidence lingered. A pile of bones stacked near the hearth, some blackened by flame, others stripped with a precision that betrayed careful hands. Trinkets lay nearby in a crate, rings still shining through ash, buckles, small lockets and purses. Items that had belonged to the missing, proof that Keller and so many others had come here and never left. It was a graveyard disguised as a household, a butcher's den masquerading as a family farm. And then there were the smaller bones, child-sized, fragile, brittle, some scorched, others preserved in the blackened corners untouched by flame. No man spoke as they gazed at them. The whispers that the Harpers had turned against their own blood were no longer whispers. They were bone-deep truth, written in ash and silence. The barn told its own story. When men pried open its doors, cracked from fire but still standing, they found the charred remains of hides hung on hooks, dried strips of what might once have been meat, now curled and unrecognizable, but enough to twist stomachs anew. The stench hung heavy, rancid despite fire, proof that this place had been more than shelter for animals. It had been a slaughterhouse for men. Not all bodies were consumed by the blaze. Amos Harper's corpse still lay in the yard where he had fallen, his shotgun beside him. Elijah himself remained half inside, half out of his doorway, his chest riddled with bullets, his hand twisted as though frozen in that last clutch for defiance. Around them more shapes, more Harpers, twisted and broken amid cinders, a clan that had lived by the rifle and the knife, now ended by it. The men of the posse stood in silence, the flames crackling. The morning air, filling with the unbearable stink of charred flesh and fear, turned into fact. They had set out to bring justice for one man, Thomas Keller. What they uncovered was justice for dozens, perhaps more, a reckoning so vast none could yet count its weight. When they returned to town, the news spread faster than fire itself. Women wept openly, clasping children to their breasts. Men shook their heads in grim disbelief. For years, the Harper name had been a curse of suspicion. Now it was fact, carved in bone and smoke. Preachers thundered that the sins of hunger had turned a family into beasts. Farmers gathered in groups, speaking the words aloud at last. Cannibals. Not rumor, not tale cannibals. The graves were many. Over the next days, when the ruins cooled enough to sift through, townsfolk searched for what remained. Bones were taken with care, marked and buried together. Few were identified, most too fractured or scorched. Yet the people buried them anyway. A mass grave raised not only for the dead, but for every fear the living had carried. The mound became a marker of justice, of warning, of the depths mankind could fall when stripped of law, love, and God. Sheriff McGraw stood at its side during the burial, his badge heavy, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and grief. He delivered no speech. There were no words fitting. The silence of the mourners said enough. For weeks the smell lingered over the land. Even the rain that followed seemed unable to wash it away, as though the fields themselves had absorbed the stench of what had occurred. Neighbors avoided the ridge entirely. Travelers spoke of the ruins as though they were haunted, not by ghosts but by memory itself. And slowly the Harper name ceased being simply a family and became a story, a warning. The story spread far beyond Missouri's borders. Men carried it west with their wagons, east through river towns, north into fields of Illinois. Every retelling bent the details, each mouth shaping the horror anew. But the essence never faltered, that hell is not a place beneath the earth, but can be found on a lonely farm in the hills, where a family ate its own and prayed to nothing but hunger, and the ruins themselves remained. For decades after, locals swore grass refused to grow on that patch of ground. Children dared each other to walk the path that led toward the charred skeleton of the farmhouse, though rarely did anyone stay long. Too many claimed the silence there was thick, as if the earth itself still held screams. Hunters avoided it. Travelers would not camp near, for evil has a way of clinging to its soil. But for those who survived the reckoning, the greatest horror was not in the ash or the bones. It was the realization that they had lived beside it for years, that they had seen Elijah Harper in their streets, had sold to him, nodded to him, let his silence excuse what they feared to name. They carried that weight always, the guilt that silence had allowed monsters to grow unchecked. The Harper farmhouse had burned, yes. The family was dead, but their memory remained, living on not as a story to frighten children, but as a scar upon the land. Proof that sometimes shadows walk not as men feared, but as men themselves. When the smoke of the Harper farm finally faded into the autumn sky, Missouri exhaled as though a weight had been lifted. The farmhouse was gone, reduced to blackened beams and twisted iron. The Harpers themselves lay in shallow graves, their reign of silence ended by fire and rifle. For a time afterward, the county breathed easier. Children walked with less fear, and travelers once again dared the roads that had grown cursed with rumor. But the story did not die with the family. If anything, it grew. The tale of the Harper clan spread across Missouri and beyond as though carried by the wind itself. At first it was shared in hushed voices. The farmers who had faced them, the widows of men who fell in the fight, the sheriff who still carried scars not upon the skin, but within the soul. Soon enough it left the county altogether. Stagecoach riders carried it west. Riverboat hands spoke of it down along the Mississippi. Soldiers retold it as night stories while encamped. The words changed, grew, and bent with every retelling, but always the same heart remained, that there had been a family in Missouri. That hunger and cruelty had twisted them, that they had devoured not strangers alone, but kin, that they died in blood and fire, and that their land bore scars forever after. For some, it was tale enough to frighten children from wandering too far at dusk, an American fireside reminder of the dangers that lurked when men abandoned the laws of decency and faith. Mothers would hush their children with the words, "Don't stray, or the Harpers will take you." For others it became a parable repeated from pulpits, a warning of what mankind becomes when greed and hunger devour the heart. Not devils, but worse, humans stripped down to appetite. Sheriff William McGraw never escaped the story. Though the people praised him for bringing an end, he did not see himself a hero. Each time he passed the mass grave where Keller and countless nameless others rested, he felt not triumph, but sorrow. He had been too late. Too many bones had been collected from the ashes. Too much silence had allowed evil to grow bold. His badge weighed heavier after that, as though the metal carried every ghost that now haunted the hills. For the survivors of the posse, the memory never faded either. Some carried wounds in body, scars across shoulders and arms, limps earned in a storm of bullets. Others carried the quieter wounds, the sound of rifles in their sleep, the vision of charred bones where a hearth should have been. Men who once laughed openly in saloons now held their liquor in silence, staring into the wood grain of tables, their minds elsewhere. For each of them had seen the truth of human hunger, and it left no man unmarked, and the land itself remained seared. The Harper Ridge was avoided by most, even years after. Farmers left it fallow, claiming nothing grew right upon that soil, that the crops withered too soon, that beasts refused to graze there. Children dared one another to walk to the ruins, but fled before reaching the blackened stones that still marked where the farmhouse had stood. Travelers spoke of an uncanny stillness when passing by, a silence where even birds seemed reluctant to sing. It was not ghosts, no. It was memory, an earth soaked with too much blood to ever forget. In time, historians recorded pieces of the tale. Newspapers of the age carried accounts, fragmented and sensational. Their headlines thundered across Missouri and neighboring states. Some called it proof of America's wild brutality, that even families in the heartland could become predators. Others denied it, claiming exaggeration had twisted truth, calling it nothing more than a frontier myth. Yet those who lived closest knew better. They had seen the bones. They had buried the remains. They carried more than rumor. They carried the stink of it in their lungs and the image of Keller's wagon in their eyes. As the years passed, the Harpers became something more than men and women. They became symbol. To some, they were the embodiment of hunger's cruelty. To others, a cautionary tale of isolation, how separation from community festers corruption. Eventually, they became legend. Farmhands crossing the county decades later would whisper to one another of the cursed ridge. "Best not camp near Harperland," they'd murmur, or you'll hear them in the night still chewing. Children in faraway states traded versions of the story like ghost tales. There was a family who ate their own in Missouri back in the old days. The names blurred, the details bent, but the essence lived on. What made the legend endure was not horror alone, but truth. Unlike campfire fables spun from air, the Harper story carried weight. There had been a sheriff. There had been bones. There had been a fire that burned the house to ruin. Even as generations passed, the details could not be fully scrubbed away. And so rumor became history, and history became myth, etched into America's darker folklore. Yet for those few who had truly stood before Elijah Harper in the flesh, who had smelled the smoke and watched the rifles spark, the legend was no romantic tale. It was a memory bitter as bile, a knowledge of what men can become if hunger erases all law and love. They spoke rarely, aged in silence, carrying the burden like men who had stared into an abyss and seen their own reflection staring back. By the turn of the century, the Harper farm was nothing more than stones and weeds. The county moved on, at least outwardly. New generations tilled fields, built schools, married, lived, died. Yet whenever conversation turned to the old years, one story inevitably returned. A story with no need for ghosts or monsters, no need for superstition. A story of men and women who chose flesh over dignity, who turned survival into savagery, and left behind only ash. And so the horrifying legend of the Harper family endures still. It is told not because people wish to remember, but because people need to. It lingers in the cracks of history, warning that civilization is but a thin veneer, and beneath it lies the hunger of beasts. Missouri has changed. The hills are quieter now, the roads safer, the farms prosperous. Yet anyone who walks too long through its ridges at dusk may still feel a watchfulness in the air, a memory pressing like a chill upon the skin. They may pass where the farmhouse once stood, note the silence of birds there, the way even the wind seems to hush when crossing. And they may recall hearing, somewhere, sometime, the story of a family whose hunger consumed them whole. Not a ghost story. Not a myth, a truth so dark it lives on as legend. The Harper family, 1883, Missouri, the clan that ate its own. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.